So thank you very much for having me. It's a treat. This is from Cornell. I'm very disappointed that you guys did not just come because of me, but anyway, it's really nice to see you here. So many friends and family, which is great. So algorithms have developed into somewhat of a spectacle and in social scientific inquiry, and I find this both very interesting and very puzzling. I find it very interesting because it's one of these terms that draws together people across disciplines from very different strands of life and areas of inquiry, and there's been a lot of community building around this and a lot of activity. You will see lots of papers, probably more special issues or even books coming out that have the word algorithm in its title, so there's something really great about this. But there's also something very puzzling about this use of algorithms as both a topic and a resource in social scientific inquiry. And this puzzle is, for me, the following. So on the one hand, people talk about algorithms as something that shapes, sorts, controls, classifies, or otherwise governs our lives. So it has this powerful entity that is incredibly important for many different things, and usually this statement is followed by a list of heterogeneous areas. So people like finance, social media, education, and everything. But then on the other hand, algorithms are inscrutable, they are kind of obscure, they're really complex and difficult to understand, which is then the other side of this puzzle. And together, it's not really clear what's going on, right? On the one hand, we have this powerful entity, on the other hand, it's inscrutable. So what kind of object is this, and what can we learn about this object and think about this puzzle, rather than taking algorithms for granted as something that we just have to know that is out there. This will be, struggling with these questions will be the main focus of my talk today. It's not, I think I've given more polished talks, so Massimo mentioned that it's okay to confront you with challenges and incoherence, and that you have a high tolerance for that, which is great. I already had a wonderful session over lunchtime with really smart graduate students who took apart a paper of mine, which was fantastic and one of the most helpful experiences recently. So I hope you will do the same. So, as Massimo mentioned, this talk is part of a larger project which mainly stems from my PhD research, which I've been working on for a couple of years now, and also some smaller initiatives, of course. The overall theme of the project, which will hopefully, not yet, but hopefully at some point become a book, takes issue with the recent rise of technologies of valuations, the various review, rating, and ranking schemes in two very different settings: web-based patient feedback and search engine optimization. And the latter is what I'm going to talk about today and draw some attention to. So for today, I have three goals. First, I would like to, let's throw this up. So first, I would like to offer an alternative way of thinking about algorithms that takes the struggle and the puzzle I mentioned initially seriously and turns it into a strength. Second, the second goal is I'd like to demonstrate that it's actually possible, despite growing concerns about inscrutability, lack of transparency, and so on, to study these phenomena ethnographically. And third, I would like to suggest that this all can help us rethink some of the current more political concerns about secrecy and transparency in algorithmic system. So here's a quick outline. I'll start by recounting my own troubles with algorithms. I will then spend some time, because I think it's useful for understanding where I come from and how I ended up in this area, on talking about my ethnographic strategy. So you're about to witness a miserable failure of mine initially to study algorithms ethnographically, and I thought it might be useful for you to understand how I failed and why I failed and where I went next. And then I'm mainly going to focus on 4 moments of struggling with algorithms in practice based on my fieldwork with search engine optimization consultants. I'm going to explain what exactly that is. And then I have a few concluding remarks. And if you have any questions at any point, then feel free to ask me or let me know if there's something not clear. And there might be a lot, actually. All right, so this talk is titled Spectacular Algorithms, and there really has been a bit of a spectacle going on, right? So I already mentioned there's a whole flurry of books, a surge of books that have algorithms in their title. Automate This is one example, How Algorithms Came to Rule the World. The Black Box Society by Frank Pasquale, The Secret Algorithms That Control Money and Information. There's popular Tumblrs. One is titled #AlgoPop, which kind of features all kinds of little news about algorithms. There's apparently something that's called algo raves, where people dance to algorithms, which probably is like dancing to EDM or electronic music, but it's called dancing to algorithms. And then of course there's the pinnacle of something having entered the popular imagination, which is a TED Talk on algorithms. And of course then there's a final phenomenon. When you look at the New York Times technology section, it's really interesting. There's increasingly headlines that feature the word algorithm, but it's the same headlines mainly that 5 or 10 years ago featured the word system or technology or computer. So there is this kind of substitution, this move towards this other concept, and it's interesting to think about not just what it is and learn about it, but also how this happens and what it means for the kinds of inquiry that we all engage in various projects from different perspectives. So this is a very dilettantic overview of current approaches to studying algorithms, but I thought it's useful to at least highlight some approaches to get us all on the same page and as a basis for what is to come. These are just snippets really from studies. I could have chosen many others. What I would like to highlight here is that there's different strategies for dealing with this new entity called the algorithm, right? So one is to theorize the phenomenon, right? To think about algorithms in theoretical terms, and you find sociologists like Scott Lash, who has written about algorithms as pathways through which capitalist power works. You have people like Nigel Thrift, human geographers we talked about earlier today. We talked about algorithms as the technological unconscious. You have historians of science, Lorraine Darston, who has written about algorithms and the rule of rationality. So she talks about algorithms as the rule of rationality that replace the self-critical judgments of reason. There's a whole era of Cold War rationality she talks about. And then there's media scholars like Ted Striefers, who talks about the black box of algorithmic culture, which wraps abstraction inside of secrecy. So there's a lot of attempts to get closer to the phenomenon theoretically. Then of course there's a second move, which is to get closer to the phenomenon by empiricizing. So mainly what we have at the moment is a lot of calls to do that, actually, less so attempts to actually do that. So Stephen Graham, for instance, wrote, "It's time for a concerted, multidisciplinary effort to try and open up the black boxes that trap software sorting." Or David Beer, in a much cited article, wrote about, so what is needed are descriptions of power through the algorithm, developed by focusing on those working with applications and software, by focusing on the applications and software as material entities, or by focusing on those who engage with the software, which is basically, seems to me, another way of saying we have to study engineers, technology, and users. So there's calls to empiricize the phenomenon, and then there's of course a lot of politicizing going on, because algorithms, by virtue of this puzzle that I mentioned initially, this spectacular puzzle of both being very powerful and inscrutable, fit in very nicely with kind of political conception of power, right? So there's a nice parallel, I'd suggest, which would be really interesting to look into between current talk about the algorithm and other figures like stubbornly seductive stories about the origins of power, like the invisible hand, for instance, right? Adam Smith. So that's a similar thing, right? It's very powerful, but it's not quite clear how this works, or natural selection, right, in genetic systems. So there's interesting parallels, and it's interesting to think about what that means. I'm not going to do that today. I just want to flag that this is part of this phenomenon and all these approaches, which are, of course, all interesting and great, I know. So, the trouble with algorithms is one that I already mentioned. There's this algorithmic drama, that's how I've called it in different contexts going on, that algorithms are supposed to be both powerful and inscrutable, which makes for a formidable drama and opens up this space where we can do all kinds of social scientific inquiries. There's a widespread concern, of course, both on the political level as on the kind of social science level with knowing algorithms. There's a lot of people writing papers at the moment. So how can we study algorithms? 6 methods for studying algorithms, 7 approaches to do so. And this mainly is then comes out in calls for one more research, which is great for all of us, of course. There's calls for transparency, there's calls for audit or algorithmic audit, and there's calls, last but not least, for interdisciplinarity, because people then argue, okay, to understand this phenomenon, it's not enough to be an ethnographer or a sociologist, but you also have to be a computer scientist or a mathematician. So there's interesting dynamics going on, and of course in science studies we have an idea of what's going on what's behind these claims and how they work and have their own politics, which again is another interesting topic I'm not going to talk about today. Finally, there is this trouble with algorithms that I find most interesting, that I've encountered in my own research, which partly developed some of the ideas I'm going to articulate today, but also happened to friends and colleagues of mine, and that's namely that algorithms tend to disappear under closer scrutiny. That's of course not really groundbreaking news, right? You have this phenomenon articulated in phenomenology by Merleau-Ponty, where you say when you really look at something it disappears. Alfred Gell has done this in anthropology, but it's interesting that it happens here because it kind of subverts this idea that you can actually study algorithmic systems. And so a lot of people who set out to study algorithms in the first place end up actually studying, my friend Nick, algorithmic systems, or Martha Poon, they stand up material history of credit scoring, having started out with algorithms. They start like Lucas in Trona, start out with algorithms in Turnitin, the plagiarism software, and then end up talking about algorithmic assemblages. Or Kay Crawford starts talking about algorithms in social media and ends up talking about spaces of contestation between technology and human agency. So there's something interesting going on here, which is really difficult to grasp. It is on the one hand this kind of big concept that we love to work with, that a lot of people invoke at the moment, but there's something really tricky and stubborn to study them from a social science perspective. And so the critique here would be that there's little attention really to the messy and contingent work of engaging with algorithms in practice, or with algorithms in practice, I should do now, use our scare quotes, our STS scare quotes really. All right, so what I would like to do today, and this is kind of the wrap-up of this first part of trying to map out a different approach, is something different. I would like to do something that my colleague Mike Lynch has put in his own words very nicely. Of course, I only plugged in the word algorithm here. And I would like to look at algorithms as a topic of empirical study, so to look at how algorithms come to be in practice, and algorithms as a theme that is mobilized for organizational purposes. Because that's this fascinating space where you can study how people deal with algorithms and at the same time have mirrored your own engagement with this term all the time again, right? In a different setting, in a different context, but that's where you have these two levels and where it's getting really interesting. I'm not going to go into these things here. They're just hand-wavy references to huge bodies of literature that would be impossible to summarize. Anyway, this is more to indicate some sensibilities that I like to work with. Many of them come from science and technology studies, to look at technoscientific artifacts as networked in practice. I've done a lot of thinking around ideas of ontological multiplicity and how things are enacted in practice, and more than one but less than many, as Anne-Marie Mollenweit's quoting Marilyn Strathern. Then there's another set of literature that I find very interesting. This is social studies of audit and valuation, which is especially useful to study evaluative practice, the broader context of this project. And then I draw a lot on ethnomethodology, to think about order as an ongoing accomplishment, as something that happens in practice. And taking all this together and studying algorithms as a topic of empirical study and as a theme that is mobilized for organizational purposes, then leads to a very broad question, which is, well, how do algorithms figure in the everyday work practice of the people who deal with them? And these are engineers, users, users, computer databases, and you can extend this list and so on. So keep that in mind. That is kind of the approach today. The goal is not to figure out what an algorithm actually is, but to use the algorithm as a focal point to understand all kinds of organizing relations that are happening around it. Okay, so what did I actually do? When I started my PhD in 2009, a long time ago, almost 100 years ago, I made a long list of valuation schemes, of ranking and rating schemes, and of course, one that was at the very top was the search engine. So this should look familiar to all of you. I'm sure you've seen that before. This is a search engine results page, or as search marketing professionals like to call them, this is a SERP, right? A search engine results page, SERP, a SERP. And there's something really interesting going on, and the reason I basically got really interested in this now also for the talk today, and going through my materials and thinking about, people want to hear something about algorithms, how can I, what do you have that speaks to that? It's interesting because in this context, algorithms are actually salient, right? It's nothing that we bring to the analysis of the system ourselves, but people talk about algorithms in this context. People struggle with them, people contest them, it is a topic, so it's salient in other ways, which is different from a lot of studies, I think, at the moment, where the algorithm is invoked as an analytic resource rather than a topic of inquiry of social practice. So this is mainly a brief backdrop. I mean, you should all be familiar with that. This is a search for one of the most contested terms probably ever, Amsterdam B&B, bed and breakfast. As one of my informants, an SEO consultant, described this as a war zone, basically. So you have two segments, actually three when I think about it. You have the paid search, which is this area here and this area here. This is a separate area of search marketing, which is called pay per click. There's a whole technologically really interesting system behind that, and where basically web spaces auction off for certain keywords. I'm not so much going to talk about this today. There's a little element here which was introduced some years ago when Google introduced universal search. This is a kind of widget that Google uses itself for B&Bs to advertise basically its own services. And then down here is, and unfortunately it's cut off because the screen is more kind of landscape than portrait. Here is where the actual search results start. So these are the 10 blue links that you have on every side, and I found that's a good way of thinking about it. It's basically a top 10 list that is dynamically reconfigured based on a keyword you enter. So, and this is the space called organic search. This is the term that the search marketing industry uses, which is the contested one. So ranking down here is very important. Why is it important? Well, one, it's important because Google is the market leader. In Europe, it's usually above 90% market share. In America, it's a bit less, but still overwhelming. Two, people usually only click on the first page when they search for something, and usually also only on the first 1 or 2 or 3 results. So it's very desirable to be up there. And third, it's just a very big market. So in 2010, the search marketing industry in the United States and North America was estimated at $16.6 billion, and that's probably grown since then. So there's quite a lot of volume behind that. So when I looked at my list, and I thought, okay, that's great. A lot of people are interested in this. This is relevant, and even for today's purposes, algorithms are salient because people talk a lot about Google's algorithm. That's one of the key concepts when it comes to these discussions about secrecy and so on. So what I want to do now is briefly recount my initial attempts to study this system ethnographically. And as I warned you, I failed miserably. But there's something interesting about that, because for those of you who do ethnography, you know that access negotiations are one of the most interesting thing ever, and is actually one of the most telling experiences you can have about a site, especially when you're new, because you learn a lot, especially at the beginning when you're entering, trying to be an insider while being an outsider, and learning from the difference between the two, which is a very broad and basic understanding of ethnography, but one that I like a lot. And that's, of course, especially relevant at the beginning. So my first idea was, okay, so how do I engage with this fascinating system that everybody's interested in? I basically have to become embedded with the search engine operator, right? So my goal will be to do an internship or something like that in one of the search teams at Google, the web spam team, the web quality team, one of their big teams, and then I can write about it and see what people actually do in practice, how they work with algorithms and all these other things, how rankings, relevance is fabricated, constructed. So that will be amazing. That was very naive with hindsight, of course. I mean, probably more today so than at the time, but I thought this would be a great idea. But it's interesting what happened then. So one of the first things I did is I just surfed, I just Googled, and so the first thing you find is you don't find an email address for Google, right? Which is kind of interesting in itself. So there's something really, that was the first insight, there's something interesting going on. And then I basically found one guy who you will encounter later again in a short video, and his name is Matt Katz, and he's something like the public face of the engine. Matt Katz, he's an engineer in the web spam team at Google, and he's the one who goes to all the conferences. So I found him, and his email address was available, at least I could Google it, by Googling for his name at google.com, so that worked out. A lot of people had done this before, and the magic was that he actually replied, and I still get kudos from people in the search marketing industry for getting at least a reply from Matt Katz. So I just want to highlight that here. Please look at this. It's very cool. So he basically replied and he said, so here's a very cheesy, down here is a very cheesy attempt of mine as an early PhD student to kind of get my way into the organization. But then he basically responds, hey, I'm pretty swamped, but if you happen to catch me at the conference, so I was asking about a conference I wanted to go to see him and interview first and then sneak in my way. Didn't work. I'd be happy to chat for a few minutes. I'm taking off the week before you arrive, so I'll be in catch-up mode most of the time you're here. Negative, smiley, mad. So that was the first response. Of course, I followed up, right, within 10 minutes. I got that email, but nothing came back, and I did not actually see him at the conference, because one of the other phenomena that I'm going to mention a bit later is whenever there's a representative of a search engine operator at one of these industry conferences, after they say something on a stage, there's a long queue of people who want to talk to them. And of course, that speaks to this issue of secrecy and trying to get information, trying to learn something. So that did not work. Then I tried to catch a colleague of Matt Katz, a kind of a representative of the webmaster team at a conference. And basically, this is what happened there. It's a rather long dialogue. I'm briefly going to read it out. This was Jen. Jen was working as another representative, not as high profile as Matt Katz, but I basically called her after there were 10 people in front of me at the conference, after she was on a panel, basically. I said, hi Jen, you're really popular, it seems. She said, yes, and she already looked at her watch. That's how it is at these conferences, but it's so exciting, you know, like I meet so many interesting people and we get really good feedback. So what can I do for you? I said, well, I was wondering whether maybe I could contact you for a research interview. And she asked, a research interview? Yes, I'm a PhD student at Oxford, and we just started a new project on search rankings and how people make sense of them. That's how I initially framed it. She says, well, this sounds interesting, but I don't know whether I will actually be helpful. You know, it's actually all online. Like, I don't think there's much I could add. Have you had a look at Webmaster Central? For those of you who are not familiar with that, so that changed its name. It's called the Search Console now, but it used to be the interface for webmasters to monitor the health of their sites, as they call it. And then I said, yes, of course. Well, I would be really interested in your perspective. So what it is to deal with all these webmasters on a day-to-day basis and so on. And she says, okay, well, and she again looks at her watch. So this is my card, just send me an email. If I don't respond after 2 weeks, then just send it again. Okay, so, oh, that sounds great, many thanks. So needless to say that also this did not really turn into a kind of an extended ethnographic immersion at this company. And then finally, there was one last round of last resort. I had a friend of mine actually knew an in-house ethnographer at Google. Google actually has ethnographers, and so they do like workplace ergonomics, I think, so not so much these questions. And so I got this email address. I was really grateful. I thought, finally someone who understands me, and basically I wrote another email to her, and then I got this email back. And in this case, I'm not even allowed to show the email, because even the email is confidential, and I'm not allowed to use it in a talk. So I basically got the response, and I basically had to redact the information because it's so confidential and secret. So that tells tells you a lot about a culture of secrecy, about what it is to use materials from access negotiations, and that also tells you what it means to be naive and try to enter a big tech company as an ethnographer without working for that company yourself. But it also tells you an interesting story about what else you can do, because one great thing about ethnography, and that's why I like this mode of research so much, is that whenever you encounter a problem, you're not the only one who encounters a problem. This might be due to a great failure of being an ethnographer, but usually it speaks to something that is really important about the setting. And so it took me a while, but after a while then I figured out that I'm not the only one who has these access problems. There's actually a whole industry that struggles with this on a day-to-day basis and is more or less trying to do the same that I have been trying to do. And that's how I came to study the search marketing industry, and especially the search engine optimization, the SEO in industry. As I mentioned before, these are people, the SEO consultants, who have turned these access struggles into a profession, basically, and it's a growing industry that helps clients rank in search engine results pages. Both these two areas I showed you before, the organic search area mainly, and then pay-per-click, which is the paid advertising one, and it's a very valuable industry. So there's a huge industry around helping you rank high in these systems and helping you get access to the system that I did not manage to get in a formal ethnographic way. But there's a market for that, apparently, right? Not for ethnographic research, but for intelligence and knowledge of what to do in order to end up on top. And there's also, needless to say, a big industry of kind of popular books, right? There's a search engine optimization for dummies book, which is really interesting to look at in detail. Also something I'm not going to do today. So, with that, I finally had my ethnographic strategy, which already started with these miserably failed access negotiation. It was mainly my strategy then to follow the algorithm, which was a reaction to the other setting I had where I was following the postings, the reviews that people wrote. So here I was following the algorithms. And so what I did in this case, I decided to start with a participant observation with a small search engine optimization agency in the southeast of England. I was based in England at the time. Most of this comes from the UK, therefore. So I was spending 4 months with them for about 3 to 4 days a week and trying to understand what they are doing, how they interact with the engine that I didn't understand and they also partly did not understand. From then I, of course, traced a lot of stuff online on the web. So there's a lot of documents and web postings that are part of the ethnography. And then, of course, I went from there to the industry conferences, which also fulfill a very important role in this industry where everybody tries to figure out how to accomplish something and show other people that you can make a difference, even though there's no clear measure for how this works, as I'm also going to show you in a second. So there's different layers of inscrutability here already. So all this comes into the big box. There's field notes, original documents, interview transcripts, lots of photos and videos, and then I try to shake the box and come up with some nice stories and interesting stories. So, in other words, what I'm going to do now in these 4 moments, I'm going to think about 2 questions. One, so how do algorithms figure in the everyday work practices of search representatives, SEO professionals, users, databases, and computers? And 2, well, how do these practitioners deal with something that is so hard or potentially impossible to know and still get by? So that's the interesting question that I would like to look at here. Okay, so look at the first episode where these questions, where these tangents come up. So when I started, a lot of people just by virtue of me having a university affiliation thought that I would be someone who could study the engine, right? That I would be somehow a math geek or a kind of an engineer and would kind of find out how this works. And then they saw I came from Oxford University and they always thought I must be smart, which is not true. And then figure out what's actually going on. So there was an interesting feature in people's perception, but in reality, of course, I had no clue. I'm not really good with programming or coding and these things. So what I did initially, I was actually going online in my first weeks at the agency. And this is also what my colleagues recommended to me. They said, well, it's actually true what this lady said to you when she brushed you off at the conference. There is actually a lot of stuff online, and maybe you should have a look around. So So what I did then is I found out that actually in fact there is a lot of stuff, and even though there's a lot of secrecy around search algorithms, and Udi Manba, who until February this year used to be the vice president of engineering in the search team at Google, called Google's algorithms their crown jewels. There's also a lot of stuff on the web. So in 2011, Google started a new blog called Inside Search. There's a transparency initiative because people got kind of nervous about search engine results pages. It was at the same time that I think one of the FTC investigations came up. Some of you might have heard of that. So there was a transparency initiative, and actually there is a lot. So on the blog, for instance, you find statements like this one. In the past, we've published information about search on the official Google blog, more than 400 posts about search and more than 50 weekly wrap-ups, and webmaster-oriented posts on the Webmaster Central blog, more than 300 posts. We also operate a help center for search and another for webmasters. That's not to mention the search help forums, which have more than 50,000 discussions, and the Webmaster Central help forums with more than 90,000. Combine this with YouTube channels and search conference, and it's safe to say we talk a lot about search, which is another striking statement, right? So if there's so much information, so why is then everybody still trying to figure it out? Why are there all these questions if everything is here, right? I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of pieces of information. So what's so difficult, right, about understanding this algorithmic system? Now, one of the first things I found is a video which is very popular. So when I took the screenshot a week ago, it was watched by 2 million people. And that's a very simple video by Google, which just explains how search works. And at the time I thought, that's brilliant. That's exactly what I need. I'm going to learn how search works, and I'm going to briefly show it to you now. It's a very short video.
Hi, my name is Malte Ziewitz. I'm an engineer in the quality group at Google, and I'd like to talk today about what happens when you do a web search. The first thing to understand is that when you do a Google search, you aren't actually searching the web. You're searching Google's index of the web, or at least as much of it as we can find. We do this with software programs called spiders. Spiders start by fetching a few web pages. Then they follow the links on those pages and fetch the pages they point to, and follow all the links on those pages and fetch the pages they link to, and so on, until we've indexed a pretty big chunk of the web, many billions of pages stored across thousands of machines. Now, suppose I want to know how fast a cheetah can run. I type in my search, say cheetah running speed, and hit return. Our software searches our index to find every page that includes those search terms. In this case, there are hundreds of thousands of possible results. How does Google decide which few documents I really want? By asking questions, more than 200 of them, like, how many times does this page contain your keywords? Do the words appear in the title? In the URL? Directly adjacent? Does the page include synonyms for those words? Is this page from a quality website, or is it low quality, even spammy? What is this page's PageRank? That's a formula invented by our founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, that rates a web page's importance by looking at how many outside links point to it and how important those links are. Finally, we combine all those factors together to produce each page's overall score and send you back your search results, about half a second after you submit your search. At Google, we take our commitment to delivering useful and impartial search results very seriously.
Okay, so that's brilliant. So now you've actually met Matt Ziewitz. So this is the guy from which I got the response, right? I just wanted to flag this out once more. So that's interesting. What's fascinating about this kind of first piece of material is here that despite people complaining all the time about that all these companies, and especially Google, is very secretive about its algorithms, about its way of going about things, and for quite a few reasons, it's actually interesting interesting that there's so much material out there, and there's even a video that actually explains how it all works. So you've watched a video, now you know how search works. And of course it's not that easy, and that's exactly, again, this tension, right? This opening that I'm trying to get at. So what is it about this revelation and concealment that makes this such an interesting topic? So what you could do now is you could apply something that I do a lot in my research. You could do a textual analysis of the video. Textual analysis is something that Dorothy Smith, Canadian sociologist and feminist scholar, originally came up with. So you could look at the video and try to understand how the organization of the text facilitates a certain range of possible readings and thereby gets across a certain message. I'm not going to do this in great detail now because there's just no time for it, but I wanted to highlight a few topics, because a few aspects, because it's interesting to think about, well, how does that video achieve a certain understanding of search, right? As something that's, as someone just said, it's very easy, right? It's just, it doesn't take much more. And some of the aspects I wanted to highlight is, first of all, what makes it seem so easy is, of course, that you come up, well, first of all, I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there's a whole area about the setting and about the visual language of this, right? So Matt Katz is really a very sympathetic and nice guy. He has a red polo shirt, jeans, and it's just a very likable guy, which is one of his key features and what he's famous for and actually recognized and respected for. And then otherwise you have this very simple background and so on, so there's a lot to say about this. But when you think about the text and the message, then of course one reason why it comes across as very clear and transparent is that you have a problem which is very clearly defined. So in this case, and I'm going to start in the middle of the video, there's the idea, now suppose I want to know how fast a cheetah can run. I type in search, say cheetah running speed, and hit return. So that's of course interesting, right? Because you would pick this example probably to explain in a transparent way how the engine works, how the algorithms work, and not the one that I used before, Amsterdam B&B, right? Because with Amsterdam B&B, you would be in big trouble and would have a great mess, right, to explain. But with this one, it's kind of really easy. So search engine marketers have actually a very famous taxonomy of queries. So they talk about informational queries, about navigational queries, and transactional queries. That's one of the first things you learn when you attend an SEO for Beginners session. I've been through a few of those, so and that popped up everywhere. So what they're using here is an informational query. Of course, it has a clear answer, or at least a reasonably clear answer. Some people might disagree, of course, with that. So there's a clear problem, something that Dorothy Pavlov and Steve Woolder have called ontological gerrymandering, right? So you kind of frame your problem just the way so that your solution fits the problem and you've set up in a nice way. That's one element. There's also here talk about the software that does things, right? That's similar to the phenomenon I mentioned at the beginning where algorithms do a lot of things. Our software searches our index, right? And it's just happening, so there's agency already here attributed. It goes on. In this case, there are hundreds of thousands of possible results, which is basically an extension of the problem, right? So now it's a simple question is turning into an information overflow problem, which is another really specific rendition of the problem. There's no politics or anything in this. It's just a quantitative problem, and that's of course something that then can be solved. So here's my favorite sentence in the whole video. So how does Google decide which few documents I really want? That's one of the key sentences, I think, because there's it's kind of around 2 or 3 corners at least, and there's a lot to just to savor in that. Anyway, I'm not going to go too much in detail, and then there's a bit of this anthropomorphizing going on, right? So how does it find the answer? By asking questions, and then there's a whole list of questions, and of course then a special place is reserved for the algorithm, for Pagerank, which is described as a formula that's invented by Larry Page and Sergey Brin that rates a web page's importance by looking at how many outside links point at it. So that's one thing that a lot of people know, how important those links are. And then finally, this is all put together, and there's of course a huge emphasis on efficiency, because only it takes half a second. And then finally there's again the commitment, the closing commitment to delivering useful and impartial search results, and that's taken seriously. So there would be many ways you could now cut through the text and see how the range of possible readings is configured. But after this video, it's actually pretty convincing that it is not really that difficult. It is a technical process, and it deals with problems that can be solved. Now, this is very different from, of course, the experience that I had before from my access problems and troubles of getting into this thing in the first place. It's different from what search marketers say when they talk about how difficult it is to understand what's going on, how futile it sometimes is. I'm going to, the next example will go into more detail with that. So there's the question is then, what is going on here, right? So when at the same time there's something that is supposed to be inscrutable, but on the other hand that can be explained in 3 minutes and 14 seconds. And so one of the leads that I try to follow here, and as you might notice from me meandering around, I haven't 100% thought this through, but that's what I'm thinking about at the moment, is to think of this as an instant of stilled revelation, of stilled concealment. That's something that Michael Taussig, an anthropologist, wrote in a very nice book chapter on viscerality, faith, and skepticism. It's actually a chapter in which he takes apart Evans Pritchard's analysis of the Azandi and magic and witchcraft, right? And he comes up with this idea of a public secret, and I quote him here. He writes, revelation, so like telling someone how search works, is precisely what the secret intends. And this is especially the case with what I call the public secret, that which is known but not generally articulated. Or, to put it another way, thus bringing out its quality of paradox, it is that which is known not to know. And so this talk of wedges and driving deeper and deeper is beside the point, or rather is the intended and labored drama of the secret's make-believe. So I found this kind of thinking very useful because it turns this idea of secrecy kind of upside down, right? And it gets beyond this idea, this epistemic focus on we just have to know, for instance, algorithms or algorithmic systems better, and then everything will be better. But there is something going on around the system, for instance, as demonstrated in the videos and all the public relations effort, which is different, which has a different quality. And thinking of this as a public secret, as stilled revelation of stilled concealment, is something that I found very useful and something I would like to pursue. So that's one way that, for instance, search engine representatives deal with this struggle of the powerful, inscrutable engine. And actually, Marilyn Strathern has a very nice articulation of that in an article. So she asked, what does transparency conceal? And that's a nice theme to think through, especially with regard to the public relations efforts of these tech companies when it comes to transparency. All right, so the episodes now get shorter, right? So fear not. That was by far the longest. The second episode now moves into my actual field work with Pro SEO. I changed the name. It's a small SEO agency in the southeast of England. And so this is a photo of what the office looked like. It was a small agency. There were 8 full-time people working there, including the managing director, an account and administrative manager, SEO consultant, a PPC specialist, and a social media expert. And the clients in the agency ranged through a lot of industries, mostly small and medium-sized companies, publishing, real estate, legal service, finance, fancy dress, costumes, so all the things that you have in a small town and that are so important, right? So this is what the office looked like, and again, it's not surprising. I think many of you who do research in contemporary organizations recognize that. So it's mainly screens, it's screen-based work. There's computers and all the other stuff that you need, a telephone, a notepad, and a pen. So mundane stuff that matters, of course, too. The initial idea of the director of the company, Stuart is his name, was to let me do menial work, which is great when you do ethnography, so you can do all the kind of stuff that nobody else wants to do while learning what is going on. And it got even better because Stuart suggested that I actually that I document step-by-step guides on how to do routine tasks at the agency, because it's a young agency and because there is no right or wrong way of doing things. They were really concerned with preserving knowledge and best practices. So one of their concerns, which is actually again speaking to the inscrutability of this kind of problem that they're facing of understanding the engine, their strategy was to have me document what they do in a step-by-step guide, so that when they hire someone new, they don't have to explain it again, but they can read the step-by-step guide. I don't quite know if that worked out, but it was, for me, it was great, of course, right? Because I could learn many things about what was going on there. And as I said, I joined the team for 4 months. So one of my first tasks was actually to do this. One of the routine tasks at an SEO agency these days is to actually report rankings and produce ranking reports. It sounds really trivial, but of course when you're a client of an SEO agency, you want to know how you're doing, right? So because you don't Google yourself all the time for all the possible keywords, but you want to know how you're doing. So that's a very basic task, and actually it turned out to be much more complicated than I thought. So this is the second page, kind of the front page of a typical ranking report that we produced. I blanked out the name of the agency and the client. You can see some very general summary lines here, and then you see for 19 keywords the keyword performance and how the site of the client was ranking for these different keywords, right? And you can see sometimes they go up green, sometimes they go down. And so my job was now to produce that. I'm going to briefly read from my field notes so you get an idea of what happened at the time, because I would not be able to reproduce that right now. All right. So my first attempt at gathering the data caused a wave of laughter and hilarity in the office. Not knowing what to do, I had started to actually conduct searches for the keywords indicated in the previous reports and take a note of the ranking position in the search results in a separate table, which again was one of the stupid things I do, but that's how you learn, right? That's how you learn. So this was considered funny by my colleague Matt, who promptly shouted, "Look at what he's doing, he's checking ranks by hand." Under the compassionate looks of my colleagues, Matt explains that there's no need to conduct searches for each keyword. Rather, he shows me a number of tools that do the job for you and gives me a brief introduction to how they work. At the end of the session, I have a list of 6 tools in my notes, and these are basically from the top left, the rank checker by SEO Book, the rank tracker by SEO Moz, rank monitoring by Authority Labs, the rank tracker by linkassistant.com, Google's Webmaster Central, and Pro SEO's proprietary tool that's powered by Raven, a big analytics company. So to me, all these tools seem rather similar and confusing, and in fact I wonder whether it is worth remembering all the login details and learning to use them. At first sight, it seems that they do not necessarily make things easier. So what sounded like a very simple exercise turned out to be quite complex, and the first thing I found is I'm confronted with all these tools that measure the ranks of the website, how the website was doing, and you would think that's actually clear, right? What can be easier than figuring out how you rank for a certain term? So basically what I did then, I was tinkering a bit with these tools, and then I decided to use the 3 that everyone else was using, because I was supposed to document what they were doing anyway, and so I was starting to draw the data from the tools into spreadsheets, into Excel spreadsheets. So my notes draw on the results are rather disappointing. Some cells, especially for lower ranked keywords, show up as insufficient data, or hashtag error exclamation mark, or as simply empty for some tools but not for others. Overall, the ranks seem roughly to correspond to terms of pages, but are by no means identical. In some cases, they deviate so much that I wonder whether I've made a mistake. It's hard to find a pattern and a clear message in this mess. So again, something that's so easy, actually, that should be easy, turns out to be difficult, and all these tools yield different results. So my notes draw on, and this is the last segment. Interestingly, what had appeared to me as a straightforward task of checking rankings turned out to be much more complicated. Far from being an exercise in data collection, I learned that different tools use different data. For example, Google's Webmaster Central, Matt explained, uses Google Live data. This was described as great in principle, but was also met with serious doubts as to its accuracy among my colleagues. Quote, "I have a feeling that they only show you what they want you to see," says Matt. Other tools, I learned, scrape search results directly from the search engine results pages, like the rank checker by SEO Book up there. And then again, other sites use the Google API, which apparently has become much harder, except you have the older keys. So that was an issue there because they changed the keys for the API, and the ones who still had the old keys, the agencies, were better off than the new ones. So another complication. Similarly, there are differences in the level of detail and granularity provided. While the proprietary tool generated data points once a day and collected the history of rankings for the month, the rank checker tool seemed only to be able to check rankings here and now, and it was not clear when they were taken. This posed the question of how to deal with incommensurabilities, right? Shall they be extinguished, for example, by aggregating daily rankings into a monthly average and straddling this with the current rankings provided by the other tool? Which one is more accurate? So in the case of my simple rank reporting research, I got incredibly confused, and the simple task became very complicated. And of course, for me, the big question was then, of course, so what to do, right? If I cannot even find out how this page is ranking for keywords, how shall I even understand what leads to these ranks, right? So, and then the solution to the problem was this one. So I asked Jim, another SEO consultant, so how do you know which tool is best? And he says, actually, I don't. They're all slightly different, you know? And I say, well, yes, I see. It's really confusing. So which one should I use then? And he says, to be honest with you, we usually use our own, the one on the internet. You know, we pay for it, so we can as well use it. I mean, check the others too, and maybe look into it if there are big, I mean, really big differences, but it should be okay. And I say, okay, but okay, doesn't it matter for the client? He said, no, not really, because actually, like, nobody knows what's best, and there are changes all the time. Just think about personalized search. Lots of people use it these days, and we cannot really account for it in the reports. So in the end, it boils down to showing them that the situation has improved, or at least did not get seriously worse. That's all that matters, really. Does that make sense? I say, I think so. So that's interesting too, right? Because we always have this imaginary of these analytic cultures being very precise and that people optimize all the time. And again, could just be the case that I was caught in an agency of idiots, basically. But I don't think that's true. So it's my sense. It's my sense that this is a problem throughout the industry. And so what's interesting about this in terms of takeaway, so that's another way of dealing with this puzzle of the powerful yet inscrutable engine and algorithms. And so one thing that this shows is that tools are very important. There's a tool for everything, and there's also tools for assessing tools. So there's nothing without a tool, and Jim and Mike Savage, Evelyn Rupert, and John Law have called this a cascade of devices. So you need lots of devices to understand other devices. So you need one tool to understand the search engine, which in a sense is a tool itself. So you get into these kind of cycles of verification, of evaluation, which is really interesting. And the big question then is, of course, when to stop. And the question of when to stop is one that should not shock anyone who's read Garfinkel and ethnomethodology. Usually these decisions are made, of course, for practical purposes in the situation in which they occur. And in this case, it happens to be shut up and do your work, just use this one, and this is what we use. That was basically the response, and it worked. It solved the problem on a very practical level, which is different from a scientific approach. I completely realize that, but that's how a lot of these things seem to work in practice. And I found this again very impressive. So another strategy of dealing with the powerful yet inscrutable entity is to just make decisions for practical purposes. And this then accounts to something that Bruno Latour and Émilie Hermand have written about in a wonderful project, which was actually a web project, Paris Invisible City, where they go through the city and try to get the picture of the whole city, right? And they go to all kinds of utilities company to understand what Paris actually is and how they can write that up. And then they come up with this idea where they write water, electricity, telephony, traffic, meteorology, geography, town planning, all have their oligopticon, a huge control panel in a closed room. From there, very little can be seen at any one time, but everything appears with great precision, owing to a dual network of signs coming and going, rising and descending. No single control panel or synaptic board brings all these flows together in a single place at any one time. So that's another evocative phrase I found very useful. Very little can be seen at any one time, but everything appears with great precision, which was basically my impression of reporting something as simple as the ranking of a site, which should be easy, because there's much more complex stuff going on in actually optimizing the site for the web page, and that's going on. Okay, so as I said, the episodes get shorter, and we're getting to the end. I wanted to show a third strategy of dealing with the ambiguity and the inscrutability, and this is experimenting. There's quite a few experiments going on among SEO consultants. This is an experiment my colleague Jim, who you already met virtually before, conducted. He basically had an idea, as they had an idea on a regular basis, to try new things out and gain new knowledge about the algorithms and the engine. So they said, can you get a new domain ranking using just Facebook likes and tweets? Because the basic assumption, as you heard before, is that you need links to your website, right? Pagerank, now you've seen the video, now you know it. So can you get ranking just with Facebook likes and tweets? So he basically then conducts a little study, and he gathers data, and he sets up a site, yogamatcompare.com, and tries it actually out. He collects data over time to see for what keywords the ranks, and then he comes up with an analysis. So really a scientific approach almost, right? And then he basically concludes, if there ever was really any doubt about whether Google uses social signals in their search algorithm, mystery solved, they most certainly do. So that was his conclusion, and that was one of many experiments that they did, and which they published on their own SEO consultancy blog. So this is interesting because it's reminiscent of some of the analyses, for instance, that Kainor Cetina has done when she was working with financial analysts. So at one point she writes about proxy science, right, and how science is emulated in many of these analytics industries, and I think that would be a great example of what is going on there. So it is very much the language of science. It's a scientific approach, but it, as you will now see, doesn't lead to too much really, because under this post, which got a lot of attention and eventually got Jim a little speaking gig at one of the industry conferences, so he actually gave a 10-minute presentation on that, on just that post, were a lot of comments, and the comments were stuff like, another good article, Tom. I don't know why he wrote Tom, he probably meant Jim. Anyway, all these names are changed anyway. Nobody's actually named Tom or Jim, right? So, or pretty interesting test, Smiley. How does one buy likes, right? That's another question there. And someone else writes, and the typos are in there, of course, because it's what they wrote. You don't seem to rank for anything other than your domain name, which is not surprising, as there is no traffic for yogamatcompare. So someone challenges his finding. Someone else says, well, is it possible that the Google algorithm used the likes to create a short-term ranking? There's a new hypothesis coming out of the research. Someone says, wow, scientific experiment, like the time logs, gives me heart that social media work is noticed by Google. So there's a lot of community building going on. And then someone else writes, well, didn't Matt Katz, who you now know really well, didn't Matt Katz say at PubCon, which is one of the big American industry conferences, that the algorithm does account for social signals? So what you see in the comments is something that points to what these experiments, and they are very common in this industry, are at least also about. So it's not just about creating knowledge, because as you could see, that's immediately contested, hypothesized, and you turn upside down. But it's mainly also a performance of community, right? It's a way of kind of sticking together, of working together, and of acknowledging, of giving kudos, of maybe criticizing if you have an enemy who does something, and so on. So there's a huge part of this is a performance of community. And finally, then I want to highlight one aspect that actually makes this even clearer, and this is the idea of expert gossip. So this actually takes you to the last station for today, which is one of the industry conferences. In this case, it's the Search Engine Strategies Conference. I'm very proud of this again, so I had to juxtapose these two. This was the first batch I had in 2008 when I didn't even start, and I was just interested in this area, and I went to Search Engine Strategies in San Diego because I just happened to be there, and all I got was this lousy pass with Expo only sign, so you can only go to where the people advertise their services, and I even get advertising on top of my badge. And this is the last one I got really after 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork and making lots of contacts. This is, I just like to highlight, this is an all access pass. This has the golden letters down on the blue sign here, and it's really nice, and but it's kind of funny to emphasize this, of course, but it's also an aspect, I think, of ethnographic work that is not often appreciated, that it's an awful lot of work to get into these things, where such a ticket would usually cost up to 3,000 British pounds, right? And talking your way into that is a great skill that you can use in all situations in life. So these are the conference, and they again tell you something about access, right? And who gets in, who gets out. So there's another level of dealing with secrecy and access to certain spaces, inscrutability. These conferences are very much, as you would expect, very much is the stuff we're doing now. This is a session which is a kind of cheesy, which has a very cheesy kind of visual, because it speaks to the theme, but you find a lot of that, right? People presenting like Tom or Jim earlier, his experiment, there's some celebrity speakers, and there's of course many of these conference sessions are geared towards people like me or like you, I assume, who know nothing about this, because that's where the market for the conferences is mainly. So there's a lot of that going on, and of course, again, it's also about building the community of people who are against the big engine. You clearly have this sense, right, of kind of coming together. At many talks that you have, what we have at our conference too, right? The back channels are almost more important than the talks. I mean, maybe not right now, because you're still half awake. That's good. But usually people there's a lot of tweeting and whatever, blogging and Instagramming probably these days going on, which is really interesting. And so what you also have is a lot of gossip at the conference. And again, this is a funny thing, but it makes a huge difference and is a huge part of what this is about. And this is just a collection of quotes that you can pick up during the day, where people, which all conspicuously deal with this issue of the inscrutable engine again. Well, the truth is out there, says someone. Or there's an overheard conversation. I feel that the algorithm, and especially the linking algorithm, has become a lot stricter from a content point of view. So therefore, it's so much more important to concentrate on on-page areas. And then the other says, who told you that? That's complete bullshit. Bullshit. Or someone says, well, if these guys still believe in keyword density, then good night. Or people say, there's a good video from Google where they say that validation is not important. Someone say, we have a saying in Denmark that says it's really hard to predict anything, especially the future. There's someone said, site speed has always played a role, in my mind at least. Someone says, I've seen a lot of cases where it didn't work. And finally someone says, if Rob says it's true, I believe it. So what you can see here is just an expression of this confusion, of this kind of poking around, of trying to figure out what is going on, and mainly of gossip, of expert gossip, which is so important in this community and holds it together. One of the most tricky things at these conferences is actually not to get this all access pass, but is to get invited to one of the after conference drinks at some pub in London, where then people say that's where the really hot tips are exchanged, right? That's where people will share the really important stuff. And so there's a really interesting economy of secrecy which spreads out and is very important for this whole community. And finally, I'm not going to introduce you to these characters in detail. You also have, of course, celebrity speakers, right? So people who stand out, who are the mainstays in the conference circuit. You've different characters. It's interesting to look into their biographies, because you also learn a lot about this business and what it is to engage with this engine by looking at them. There's Ralph Tegmeyer. His kind of industry name is Phantom Master. He's kind of the reputation of doing black hat and cloaking techniques in SEO, and it's very much sought after for that. This is a guy from Denmark, Mikkel Svensson. He used to be on a record label for cheesy pop music. Now is a celebrity speaker at SEO conferences. He's very much the creative person. There is Sherry Thoreau, who has very much a scientific approach. She actually wrote a book on SEO called Search Engine Visibility. And then there's someone like Jim Boykin, who also shows up a lot, who basically tells people to make sure that there's no search engine representative in the room before he starts his talk, because he doesn't want them to hear what he's telling them. And he's got the nerd image and cultivated that a lot. So you have a lot of this celebrity status, and most everyone knows these people when you ask search engine optimization optimization consultant. There's of course more, but they're almost as famous as Matt Cutts, who definitely everybody knows. And of course there's just a quick highlight. Of course, because it's so difficult to figure out who knows what and what actually works, there's of course rankings for SEOs too, right? So there's search engine optimization, consultancy rankings. Top SEOs is the most famous one. There's a couple of others too. And so this then leads me to the last insight of this expert gossip, that secrecy can also be generative. I mean, Georg Simmel, of course, has written about it, but I found that idea most usefully in work by Joseph Mastro in the nuclear bomb